At the end of my newsletter, I like to show every once in a while images of the samples I receive, just to kind of like show proof that I've had stuff licensed to the art buyers, because I think kind of builds up credibility.
Yeah.
They see that, like that you are like a licensed artist.
That's a really good idea. Welcome to another episode of Brushing Up. We're talking about greeting cards. The last episode we also talked about this, but this was a bit more about building your portfolio, starting up. But we want to talk a bit more about what's next. So we're going to talk about a few different ways that you can sell and market your greeting card designs, about licensing, print on demand, in-person selling, and then a couple of different tips as well. If you want to sell and market your greeting cards, the biggest one or the most known one that we want to talk about is licensing your greeting cards. And Cody, you know a bit more about this. Can you, for people who have no idea about this, can you explain what licensing is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like renting your artwork to a company or a manufacturer. So a lot of times that means you work out an agreement where you get a percentage of the sales, or it could be something to where you get like maybe a little deposit upfront fee, and you don't get a licensing until you meet that upfront price that you were paid. Or it could be you just get that automatically, and you also get, in addition to it, get like a percentage. That's something that usually the company you work with either has some type of standard practices that they've established, or you negotiate it. Or as I've encountered some companies that they do both licensing and what's also another thing that you can do, which is just outright selling the rights, which there's no licensing involved. It's just you're basically selling all the rights to your artwork to the company.
Okay, so you're basically either selling the rights to your design or renting it out for a certain period of time or on a certain product. In this case, greeting cards. So it's not actually physically your own work, but the digital design usually, right? And that goes to a company.
Yeah. Even if you create it traditionally, usually you're submitting it as a digital format to them.
Okay. And then the company is the one that sells the greeting cards to the customer.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. I feel like we talked about this a few times before, but every time it's just a new concept to me. So if you want to get started with this, like actually license your greeting card designs, how do you try to sell your stuff? What's the first step you take?
I'm sure there's multiple ways you can go about doing it. The way I go about doing it is I will just look around me and see where greeting cards are sold. So that could be just as simple as going to a store that offers greeting cards and just looking at the back of the card, because there's always the information of the company who is manufacturing it. And there's also usually like the artist who did it as well. So you can look up the company, but then you can also look up the artist. And sometimes the artists, maybe they specialize in greeting cards. You can look at their list of clients they have on their information on their website. But yeah, you can specifically look for specific greeting card companies just by seeing what's out there. And you can look online too, but you'll want to figure out, once you figure out companies that offer greeting cards, you'll want to look to see who's the person who manages either the art buyer or the art director who manages that art acquisition, and get their information so that you can start pitching your work to them.
Okay, so you need to find those specific contact details. That's interesting.
Yeah. I did 2 online shows a couple years back. And those online shows provided all the contact information of all the art directors who attended those shows. So I was able to reach out to them afterwards and pitch my work to them. But you can also, if you don't have that, you just research the companies that you find that you want to work with, being out there in retail and out in the world and just seeing what's offered in stores and collecting that information that way. And you can go about getting their contact information. There's some tools that you can use, such as I use LinkedIn a lot. So I'll find a lot of times they have a company page. And then I will also use a tool called Rocket Reach, I think is what it's called. And it's basically it's a way to look up email addresses for people. So that's one way. And then also like the trade shows too is a good way. There might be some other ways that other people have done this, but yeah,
Yeah,
those are the two big ones how I go about doing it.
that's really helpful. And I love how specific that is. Like, that is so actionable. I think if you want to get started with licensing your designs, then you can get started right away by doing this. It's really, really helpful. So you mentioned trade shows. I know that you talked specifically about Certex before. Why are those shows so important?
Art directors are specifically going to those shows to buy art. So it's a good way to automatically get them all basically in one room together.
Mhm.
And anytime they stop by your booth, you're like likely to get their contact information. Like when I exhibited at Certex, I had like a client intake form and I had them fill out all their information. So I got information like how many times they're buying art in a year, like what type of themes they're looking for. I was writing, like taking notes on like what type of art they liked for my portfolio when they were reviewing my portfolio in the booth,
Yeah.
what they were like in need of. And so it's kind of a great way because it's like also getting contact information that's a lot harder to find online. So if you like, especially those big name ones, they tend to go there more to those trade shows. And so
Mhm.
you could have a really hard time finding that information online. But if you do like either like an online show even or an in-person show, that's a great way to kind of like get over that hump if you're having a hard time finding specific people or companies.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I also had no idea that they could, while you're there, immediately comment on what they're looking for and give feedback on your portfolio as well. That's really helpful.
And it's great because you can follow up with them afterwards and get them on your newsletter. So you can send them regular artwork if you have like one that goes out regularly for art buyers and
Mhm.
art directors. So yeah, it's expensive, but it's if you can do it, then it's I think it's a good way just to kind of get a feel of the whole industry as well too. And like it's fun in like meeting other people who are in the industry as well, doing it alongside you and kind of talking shop.
Yeah, of course. So you talked about having a newsletter, right? So gathering all that contact information, different art directors, art buyers, having them on a list, and then sending your work out in a newsletter. How often do you do that?
I try to do it once a month. Right now, I'm actually on a break. I specifically told them like at the beginning of the summer that I was going on a break. But before that, I was sending them art, just like a curated monthly themed, for example, like Christmas, like in December, I would send Christmas art, Valentine's Day in February, that type of thing. But I mean, you don't have to do that. It's really completely up to you and who your clients are. So if you have like specific clients in a certain industry, you might only be sending art all year long. So yeah, I would send monthly, but then I would be pitching separately to specific companies that I was interested in working with.
So the pitching specifically, what does that email look like if you're pitching to someone, a company?
So I would try to do that once a month. I'm not always the greatest at doing this, but it would just basically introducing myself, saying who I am. And then I would attach like 2 to 3 like sell sheets that had work that I thought would work well for their company. And basically that's how I would pitch my work is like saying, I think this artwork would work well and just keep following up with them by sending new work from there. Sometimes that can vary too. If you're really like good at turning around artwork, you can do that every month, but you can also do it every quarter or every 6 months. It just depends on when you like hear back from them. But sometimes I've heard it can take years.
So a bit of patience involved with that.
Yeah. Well, with greeting card companies specifically, for what I found is that a lot of times you have to get on their call list. And it was like this when I managed our acquisition for photo cards. At my last in-house job, we would have a call list. And so once you're on the call list, you'd get basically emails from the company and they would say what they were needing throughout the year. And that was when you can like send stuff out to them at that time.
Okay.
So it's almost like a step before you actually, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get your work acquired from them, but it's just kind of like an extra step before that almost.
Yeah, like a selection process.
Yeah. I forgot to mention that at the end of my newsletter, I like to show every once in a while images of the samples I receive just to kind of like show proof that I've had stuff licensed to the art buyers, because I think it kind of builds up credibility with you sometimes if they see that, like that you are like a licensed artist.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. And you mentioned that in that pitch, you send a sell sheet, right? That's kind of like an overview of some of the work that you think is relevant for that company.
So the sell sheet is just basically the final artwork that you have that's displayed. Like I have mine set up in InDesign just as individual pages, and they all have my contact information and my logo and like the name of the artwork. And it's a way for you to kind of like organize your portfolio and then also like what you're sending them, because you can also keep track of like what you're sending them.
Okay, yeah. So why is it important to submit or pitch your art at certain times?
I think it's important, especially when you're working by yourself. It keeps you on a schedule. So for example, for greeting cards from in these past few years, I've realized since I've been on the call list that it's important to like kind of keep track of when they're asking for certain artwork. And then I can prepare new stuff if I want, so that I am turning it in when they need it. And also early, because a lot of times they'll say, oh, the earlier you send this in, the better. We're going to be acquiring this art for like 6 weeks or 8 weeks or something like that. But yeah, the earlier you send it in, the better. So it kind of is good to keep on a schedule and know when they're wanting certain stuff so that you are prepared, so that you're not kind of like dropping everything to prepare stuff. I kind of did that at one point, and I just found it didn't really work very well. It's better if like I have kind of like stuff in advance and I kind of have a little bit in mind of their needs. You're just being a little bit more organized about how you're preparing it and getting it ready.
Yeah.
In some companies, they are asking for stuff like a year ahead of time, depending on the theme.
Yeah, because it's such a long process, right? So it doesn't just end with you licensing the card. Like they have to also make it work for them and do the printing and the marketing and all of that. And I think from what I'm understanding, you as someone who licenses greeting cards, is that you need to be very prepared, right? Like you need to be very organized with your art and be very prepared for what companies are looking for, because it's also a bit about quantity. Ideally, you would, be licensing quite a few things at once to be able to make it worth your time and your effort.
Yeah. Yeah. You definitely want to like build up a portfolio of work so that you can always kind of have stuff ready for them. And the more you get picked up, the better it'll be income wise. And there are certain categories that'll sell better. And sometimes it only takes like one really good card or design or artwork to really do really well. But you always want to make sure that once that maybe fizzles out, that you have something ready to go. Yeah, that's good. That can also kind of pick up the slack for when that kind of lags a little bit. So
for example, for what you talked about with timing, for example, Christmas cards, they might start needing those in January, and you have to be prepared. Right? And just kind of like be aware of what companies are looking for, and maybe use a reference from last year, from what they were looking then to this year. There's a better way to explain that, but
yeah. Well, that's also good for pitching too. So if you have an idea of when they're asking you for stuff, then it's more likely that they'll acquire stuff from you if you're pitching it at the right time as well. Of what they're looking for.
Yeah, I like that, because you, in this situation, you would be pitching so much that there's also going to be just a lot of rejection. That's normal. But at least it's not necessarily about your art being good or not, but actually about just being in the right space at the right time. I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that's stuff that you can prepare for, right? So being early with those pitches, kind of knowing what sort of things that will sell better and that they're looking for, and then applying that to your own work and your timing.
Yeah. I've heard from several other artists that it's felt like having the right art at the right time.
Yeah. So how do you deal with some of the rejection and the feedback that you get in the pitching process?
I think a big one for me is knowing like how common it is to not hear the majority of time anything back at all. Like I would say like as high as 90 to 95% of the time, you won't even hear anything back. You'll pitch and it's like radio silence. You think? Yeah. So having those tools, I think also like there's one tool that you can see if someone's opened your email. So if you're someone who likes to know if someone is viewing your email, at least I know that they've seen it.
That it reached them.
Yeah, exactly. And unless you hear a no, that's where your persistence, I think, kind of comes in there. You just kind of, like I said before, it really takes persistence and patience because it could take years to like even hear anything. So yeah, rejections I think are really common. Just knowing that I think helps a lot, at least for myself. It's not about you or your artwork sometimes. I mean, maybe it could be if you're like just starting out, like maybe you need to bulk up some skills, but it's just about knowing that it's very common not to hear anything back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned before, I think in our feedback episode, that you've had specific feedback on your greeting card designs from art buyers, how to improve your designs, how to make them more marketable, how to make them easier to pitch. What is some feedback that you think that was really helpful that applies to greeting cards often?
Well, one specifically that I got back was they thought that my hand lettering didn't fit well. So they wanted like a font, like a serif font, to see how that looked. And so I think I sent a couple options or I think I might have just sent one based on their feedback, and they accepted it right after that. They're like, oh yeah, this looks much better. So like sometimes when it's something like that, it's just like a really simple change that they want. They're like, everything looks great. I just wasn't sure about this hand lettering, how it was on here. I just didn't think it fit. And I did like how it looked actually afterwards after I changed it out for them.
I think that you mentioned before that sometimes companies just prefer to work with certain fonts to have a bit more control rather than hand lettering, which is very personal. I don't know if that was correct.
Well, some, at least with photo cards, they give you a font list. And it's because they only have licensing for certain fonts. So you had to only work within that list. Once you start working with a company, like where they're actually asking you to design stuff or to switch stuff out, they'll give you those guidelines and let you know.
Okay. And I think also mentioned before something about color. What have you found that with color you get a lot of feedback on?
Usually, at least with photo cards, it's specifically during Christmas time, they want like more traditional colors because they sell better. Just at least in the US. That's what people are wanting is more those really traditional Christmas colors, the red and the green. But I think at least when I was on the other side of it doing art with acquisition, I remember I think basically artists get bored of using those traditional colors around Christmas. And so we'd see a lot of like orangey reds instead of like really traditional, like bright or like deep reds. And we'd be asking them to change it back. And I've even been asked to do that, even though I knew that was something I would even ask artists when I was doing it to change it back. Yeah, I think it's just because you want to try something out of the box, but that's not necessarily what's selling or what people are wanting.
Yeah. And I remember you talking about something specifically purple, and those are kind of a controversial color, right?
Yeah, when I got feedback from an art rep when I had her review my portfolio, she started noticing like purple popping up in some of my pieces. And after a while, she's kind of like, here's the deal with the color purple is that people either love it or hate it. So she advised me to basically change it out because it would make it more marketable if I use maybe more of a neutral color palette. I actually liked it a lot better changing it after that with all the ones that she suggested it for. Because yeah, I mean the more you can make your art more marketable, I think the better it'll be for it getting picked up and acquired.
Yeah. You need to find a way, I guess, to still have your unique point of view, your style, but also make it as marketable as possible so that you can get it licensed. So we talked a bit about licensing, and now we're going to talk about print on demand. They're basically online stores where you can sell your greeting cards, prints, all kinds of like surface design products, I guess. And they print it for you, which means there's basically very little for you to do. You don't need to do any printing yourself. Once a customer orders from the website, it gets printed for them and sent to them, and everything is taken care of. So a couple of examples are Society 6. That's a really big one. Printful, Zazzle is a big one. Thoughtful in the UK. There's lots and lots of different options. And this is a really popular way to sell greeting cards for illustrators and designers because there's very little for you to have to do in that case. So you have a store on Zazzle, correct?
Yeah. I set it up because I work with MPX for photo cards. The way they do it is they a lot of times, ask for designs and they don't necessarily take them all. So a lot of them, some of them also, I'll be like, I think this would be a really good seller that they don't take. And it actually ends up being a big seller on my store. So it's kind of, I feel like it's a good way of taking those designs that they don't take and offering it somewhere else because people are buying it.
I didn't even think of that you could actually, if you're licensing greeting cards, that you could complement that by taking the stuff that isn't licensed and putting that in an online store. That's actually a really great way to do it.
Yeah, you could always, pitch your work, and if it's not accepted, change it if it needs to be changed. A lot of times, you can do multiple color versions if it comes down to color. But yeah, if it's just not selling or you're not getting it picked up by anywhere else, another great way is to do something like a print on demand and see if there is a demand for it.
And it's kind of passive income, right? Even though I don't love the name passive income because there's always work involved, but it's a way to have some extra income without having to do the extra work because you already made the designs for pitching.
Yeah, so your work is never going to waste, I don't think, either. And it can always be tweaked depending on client or format. So it's a great way to kind of further leverage your art, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of played around a bit with putting some cards on Thoughtful as well, which is based in the UK, exclusively greeting card designs. And it was mostly just stuff that weren't even greeting cards to begin with. Just a couple of designs I made, kind of some ideas that were previously rejections from clients or things that I just made on my own time. And you can simply put them on and see if it works. And surprisingly, it actually worked a little bit. So yeah, you don't lose anything by doing that. So there are also negatives, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, that's where you can, I think, kind of potentially go off the rails with it a little bit if it's not giving you back as much as you're putting your time into it.
Yeah. That's kind of the issue, right? The print-on-demand stores, they give you a lot of flexibility, but the problem is that if you do make sales, that usually you only get a really small percentage because there's production costs involved, sending costs, all of that. And the actual design gets only a really small percentage of the actual sales. And yeah, you can spend a lot of time putting lots and lots of designs on, but if it's not going to sell, then, it's just a lot of time that you can spend on it.
Yeah.
And what has been happening the last few years as well is that a lot of print-on-demand stores, specifically I'm thinking of Society 6, that they basically want you to pay for your cards to even show up. So it's kind of like an algorithm that you actually have to pay for. So you have to be selling a big amount, like a big quantity, to be able to actually make it worth your while financially. So it really is about quantity rather than quality in this case. If you're not spending a lot of time on the store and specifically the marketing of it, then it's going to be, I think, really difficult to actually make a decent amount of money from it. Or you could just get really lucky with one card and it does really well. You have to be lucky, I think. So that kind of happened to me as well on Society 6, where a couple of years ago I just started uploading all my cards, put everything on, made a few sales, but then they started introducing this plan where I think as I said, you have to like pay to be able to sell there. And then it just really becomes not worth it if you want to do it on the side instead of doing it full time.
Wow, I did not know that.
Obviously, it's, especially since the pandemic, if you can do what you want, like make your own designs and then be able to sell them online without really having to do the whole production cost and the sending, it's perfect. But that means a lot of people want to be able to do that. So unless you really want to spend a lot of time marketing, it's going to be quite tough.
I don't do any marketing for my Zazzle store at all, really. And I only upload maybe like twice a year. And I make probably $150 a year on it.
Okay, but
yeah, I mean, it's why I kind of continue, because I'm like, it's $150, it's nice. You have to meet like a threshold. You set your royalty, how much you want to get per sale.
Yeah.
So there's that. So you kind of control how much you get even. And they even now are letting you do your own graphics, but you can also use their default graphics. And then you have to make at least $50 before they'll pay you out. For not doing any marketing at all, I was like, it's okay for me right now.
Yeah, I think that's kind of it. You have to see if it's worth your time or not, if you want to get into it. I don't actually know what actually more to say because I have spent so little time the last couple of years to work on that. I still want to put more designs on Thoughtful as well, which looks very similar in a way as well.
I do a lot of like SEO stuff though, behind the scenes with like the tags and the descriptions and stuff. So I don't know if that helps, but yeah, Zazzle's an experience with print on demand. But I know a lot of people who do Spoonflower.
Of course,
I know that they've changed their stuff. I know it kind of sounds a little bit similar to what you described with Society 6, but I don't really know the details but I know a lot of artists were upset with their changes that they've done.
Yeah. Etsy as well, right? I mean, we're talking specifically print on demand where everything is sort of, the production is out of your control. The company does that. In the case of Etsy, you make the product and you send it. Everything is in your hands. But they've also made changes. Not everyone is happy about that as well. It's just making it a little bit more difficult for designers, for creators to sell. And another thing is that what you're talking about, when you're putting it in someone else's store, it's out of your control. You kind of have to go with their process, their guidelines, and hopefully it works out. But definitely as a tip, I would say if you put your stuff in a print on demand store, usually there's an option to send yourself some test prints or test sheets, colors, that kind of stuff. Send this to yourself so you can actually see what the colors look like and what your prints look like as well. See if you're happy and if you need to make any changes, because that's kind of out of your control.
Yeah, I did that. One of my relatives used one of my Zazzle holiday cards, and I remember getting it in the mail and being like, this color is not very good. I need to adjust it. I adjusted it after that, but I should have done a test print, really.
Yeah.
But that's how I found out.
High quality images.
I think in general, high quality images make sense for anything that you're selling online.
Of course. Yeah. I think also when you're not exclusively doing greeting cards, for example, like me, I've got lots of designs that I might, want to be flexible with in the future. So having those on a bigger size set up in Procreate just makes sense. It's always better to work bigger than to work smaller. You can size it up.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah. And it's a good idea to just check the guidelines of the store as well. They usually even have a template set up in Photoshop, so you can just drag your stuff in there and see if everything is the right format and the right size.
I know Etsy, kind of going back to print on demand, you can actually set up like Printify. You mentioned that earlier. You can set that up with
Oh,
your
okay.
Etsy store. So you can actually set that up to go on in the background, which
Like
is
connect
also
them.
kind of why some artists are upset, is because it's not quite as what they consider as handmade, as it used to be.
Yeah, everything's automated. Yeah. There's a lot of changes in this specific aspect of selling products and selling greeting cards as well. And it's complicated. But make
Mhm.
sure to do your research, know what you're getting into, which store to pick if you do want to pick one, what is in your control and what isn't, because that's important.
Yeah, that's something that I would like to also do maybe a little bit more promotion of, but yeah, like you said, I don't really want to spend too much time on it because I'm from Sketch Designer Pete's like survey that they do every year
Mm-hmm.
for surface pattern designers on how much, like, it's like their pricing survey.
Yeah,
And it's like surveying everyone on how much they make and like where their sources of income are. Print on demand is always like the very lowest of everyone on what they're making.
that's true. But I think if it's some kind of marketing or at least a little bit, Pinterest is definitely I think the most worth it, most beneficial and low effort. You can repin things, which is really helpful. And it doesn't just disappear on a wall like a feed on Instagram, for example. It actually stays and it can regain views as well. I've definitely had that in the past where I have used Pinterest for promoting, for example, also for Procreate brushes, and that works quite well.
So I think that's pretty much it for print on demand. This next thing that we want to talk about, in-person selling,
Mhm.
I definitely don't have as much experience on this as you do. Can you discuss your experience with markets and in-person events?
Yeah. So I have limited experience, but I think it is a good one to mention, especially if you're perhaps in a bigger city and there are lots of illustration fairs, in person, like market fairs, any kind of opportunity for you to sell your designs or sell greeting cards specifically, it is worth it, I would say. And I've definitely had a good experience with this. I've done a handful of markets that were not illustration fairs of any kind, but like sort of like Christmas markets where people would sell their designs and prints and greeting cards. And that was a really great way for me to get my name out there, just get people to support my stuff and at the same time sell prints and greeting cards. And I think if you could do an illustration fair, the same way that you've done Certex, for example, is a really great way to make contacts. And specifically greeting cards usually sell quite well at illustration fairs because they're kind of low cost. If you've got like lots of bigger prints and stuff, then greeting cards is a little bit more accessible, easier for people to take with.
So is it good for like networking opportunities, would you say?
Yeah, specifically that. That's why in person is so different than online selling. So for the markets that I've done, that was specifically people who are interested in just buying greeting cards. But I think if you're in an illustration fair, then you could even meet people in the industry. And so it's a perfect way to meet new people and to build connections very quickly. And what I've done at markets is when I'm selling prints or greeting cards is have these little like freebies for people to take. So these like, oh, this is a little bit, can't really see much, but it's not very sharp. It's focused on me. Let's do like makeup.
Oh, now it's not.
Yeah. So just like little sort of freebie cards on which, like thank you cards that you can also put in your orders when you sell online. But especially in person, you could just tell people to take them with, even if they don't buy anything. You never know what comes up. So to that, I just added like a QR code. There's some information. You have some space to put a message. And that has just helped to gain some traction online as well. And I have the same thing with these little business cards as well. So it's just a really great way to, in person, have lots of like little things like this on your store so that people can take those with. And I found that super helpful. Something that I wasn't really able to do as much online. So yeah.
I love that.
Um,
Everybody loves freebies and they're like an easy, fun way to market.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was at the time as well was really helpful is that I was working with clients. I'm working with clients locally. And it was a really great way to make connections because then someone be like, oh, I know someone here and there, and I'll take the card with me. I'll give it to them or send them a message. And it was just a really good way to build up a local network as well. It was super helpful. I've seen even at illustration fairs that people, have a little QR code and that you can subscribe automatically, that kind of stuff. Any way to make contact really. And I think show your work in person than online because you're holding people's attention for a little bit longer. And then for them to either subscribe to your newsletter or take something with, it's just a great way to be able to do a follow-up later on as well.
Mhm. I know whenever I attend art fairs, craft fairs, like I'm always grabbing like people's business cards that I want to like visit later online. So
Yeah.
I think that those events, if you do them, they're a great way of like also getting more of that face to face. And a lot of times when you do that, they're more likely to want to buy stuff from you.
Yeah. Making that
So
connection. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, greeting cards are just perfect. They're less of a
yeah.
commitment than a really big print. So if you are a designer and illustrator that does prints or anything like that, consider just turning them into greeting cards. They don't have to be like with a message or, specifically a greeting card, but just smaller size that people can pick up easily. And also definitely
Yeah.
add your information to that. I've done, I think it was my first collection where I just printed them, nothing on there because I thought, well, it's not my place. Like people buy these to send to other people. And the feedback that I received was, I would love to see your name on there because the reason that I'm buying these cards is because they're unique. So I want the person that I'm sending them to also be able to see your work. So if you put your name on there, just like your Instagram handle or your signature, whatever, small, people can, or a lot of people can see your work.
Yeah, I know a lot of people, they like knowing that information, especially the demographic that goes to those art fairs. They like small business type things, and they
Yeah.
are more likely to be the type of customer who will look you up. And I think maybe it's more in the beginning, but if you're shy at all about putting your name on your work, like people do actually want to know the name
Yeah.
behind the work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, put your name on stuff. Yeah. What is this
Sorry,
enormous beast walking in front of me?
but strolling through, he does not care that we're recording. He's a big cat.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good
So,
segue into the last thing we wanted to talk about, which was a little bit on some of the technical aspects and tips in terms of printing for greeting cards. I think you might have mentioned it before, printing your work to check for color accuracy. That's a really big one, I
yeah,
think.
whether
That's good
you're,
practice to get into.
I think whether you're licensing or working with clients as well, specifically in-person selling, do some test prints of your work. And not just for the greeting cards in general, right? Just to check for any kind of mistakes, anything. On your screen, things always look different than printed. And at the end of the day, the final product is going to be printed. So make sure that you see it in its final form. What I've done for in-person selling is do these like little test prints at home. This is just really basic like carton, paper. But then I would take this as an example. Oh, here's actually, I put my name on there. I'll take this to a printer and then just show them exactly what I want so that they get an idea as well. So test prints are just really useful for checking, doing final checks. So always print your work.
So the next thing I think is really important to cover is copyright and trademark considerations. I think this is really something actually specific for greeting cards, especially like when it comes to phrases and sayings. It can be really kind of confusing to know if it's okay to use a certain phrase. A lot of that stuff is copyrighted. It's important that you look and do your research to make sure that it's not and that it's okay to use. So that's something that's either royalty free. And one good thing, at least in the US, that you can check is the trademark office. You can actually go on their website and research to see if there's any phrase or saying that is already trademarked and to know if that's okay to use.
That's a really good point. I've had this a couple of times, just thinking about puns as well. They can also be trademarked sometimes. It's just something you have to be careful with. Any kind of, expressions or maybe song lyrics is a big one too. Always double check that to see if you can actually use it, because it'd be a shame if it turns out that it is copyrighted. Then your design, you can't really do much with it. This could also happen with graphics. I've had that this year, for example, working with a client on designs that were related to the Olympic Games in Paris. You cannot actually use the logo, the actual rings, for example. You cannot include those in designs. So if there's any kind of familiar stuff, obviously logos, anything that might be familiar that you want to use in your designs, then just double check before you use them.
Yeah. And I think there's also places you can go to look at if stuff is under the public domain. But you even have to be careful among that. It's like, for example, there's recently some Disney stuff that is now in the public domain, but it's very specific. Disney, like I think it's the Steamboat Mickey. So you have to be careful even within that, within what you know to be public domain, to make sure that you're not doing anything that's outside those guidelines that are put in place.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think
maybe a good rule to keep in mind is don't touch Disney.
Yeah. There's definitely some brands that are very proprietary, so you need to be careful.
Yeah. So what have you found in the process of selling your greeting cards? What has been your challenge, or what are some lessons that you've learned?
I think it's just overall in general, whenever it comes to working in surface pattern design, especially, that you have to be really just patient and persistent and just try to be as consistent as possible and figure out what works for you. Because I think for me, that's my biggest challenge, is figuring that out. And it's hard because, a lot of times that stuff changes. So it's just, I think also being patient with yourself and like adapting to the changes and figuring out, what works best for you.
I think, we talked about this before, like shiny object syndrome. You might see opportunities out there and want to do everything. And that's not specifically with greeting cards, just with illustration, with designs in general. And there's maybe sometimes a bit of this idea of like, you have to be able to do it all. You have to do all these different things. But that's not the case, and that's not viable. I've tried a little bit of everything. I've done a little bit of the online selling, the in-person selling. You cannot do it all. So it's okay to say no to certain opportunities and focus on what you actually have time for, what you actually want to do. Because even though sometimes things are sold as passive income, they always take time. They're never passive. So don't do everything. And what you also said about things being out of your control, this is especially also the case with selling through platforms. Like, they might give you the impression that they've got it all figured out and you should sell here and you should do this and do that. Those companies are also just trying to make it work, and they change as well. So it's not always in your control. And I actually found that quite comforting to know that, you do the best that you can, and it's okay if it doesn't work. You can say no.
Yeah, well said.
I'm thinking of this now just specifically because this is not related to greeting cards. This doesn't have to be in this episode at all. But for example, with Skillshare, they make changes all the time where I'm, selling my courses. They're now going to start doing digital products. They're going to focus on selling more courses separately. I like the changes, but you have to keep up. Otherwise you're left behind. So, all these platforms, you have to be able to keep up with it. It doesn't really make sense for us to be in all these different places at once. And if it doesn't work for you, then just say no. Don't do it.
I didn't know about those changes with Skillshare.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to view print on demand companies, almost like a client, really. I mean, they all have their own,
Yeah.
guidelines and like ways of working, and it could change. So,
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
yeah. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of feel like we went over that a little bit, but I want to kind of end on a positive note here instead of saying like it's all so overwhelming. If you're an illustrator and you haven't tried greeting cards before, do it. It's just really fun. It's so fun to make greeting cards. We mentioned this in the last episode, but it is also such a great way to try out illustrations and lettering together. And especially when it comes to selling, you don't have to have perfect greeting cards. You don't have to say happy birthday. They could just be your designs on a small scale. And maybe you can find a way to sell those. There's so many opportunities and so many creative ways to get your stuff out there.
Yeah, a
Go
lot
for
of
it.
times, a wall art could even work for greeting cards. That's a really good point in terms of like making it small scale. So if
Yeah.
you work primarily with wall art type creations, I've seen a lot of artists who take those and turn them into greeting cards. It's a nice little piece of artwork that you can give, and people just love sentiments. I mean, it's why what did we say in the last episode? It's like $1 billion industry. So is that what
Yeah.
it was? I can't remember. It's a lot.
Yes.
It's a lot of money.
And that's why it's so popular still, right? It's not just the tradition of greeting cards, but also a way for people to share artwork, to see artwork on a really small scale. It makes it really accessible for everyone. So super worth it to get into it. Okay, that's it, I think. That's it for this episode. Stay tuned for the next one. Is that it? You usually do
I
this
think
part.
so.
And
All
then
we have to do is clap. Strolling through, he does not care that we're recording.
it just looked massive.
He's a big cat. Come on.